Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on rare disease, short cases of rare disease. It's a beautiful Sunday today. First of all, I will like to congratulate Dr. Deshmukh sir and Dr. Khadke sir for their social cause in Aurangabad. We are very fortunate to have such crazy pediatricians among us. Because of them, we are able to see such more development and such huge development in pediatric and neonatal practice. I once again congratulate to them for the same. Now, due to this COVID pandemic again and COVID cases again rising up, for the time being, we will be able to only do digital seminar frequently. Now, today is the Rare Disease Day. And because of the availability of pediatric super specialty in our city, we are able to diagnose rare diseases. This may look rare right now, but they can become common in future. Classic example is of celiac disease, which we were thinking that it was a rare disease in few years back, but now it is very common. Definitely, these short cases will increase our clinical experience and will help us in day-to-day practice. Due to time constraint, we are at present, we are able to hold this webinar only for 2 hours, but I am sure that there are plenty of cases still waiting, and we will arrange such seminar in future also or in near future also. So those who have remained left out on this day, we will try to accommodate them in your future. I thank you all for taking some time from the busy Sunday or relaxing Sunday with us to this webinar. Now, not wasting much of your time, I hand over to Dr. Sandhya to continue the clinical session. Thank you.
Thanks, sir, for that kind introduction. And really, we can make a difference with all the subspecialties available in Aurangabad. It's our pleasure to diagnose the rare diseases or so-called rare diseases. And it is a very wonderful gathering to have all together. And how many participants are, how many audience will be there, it's a different thing, but our close group also can enjoy such discussion, and we can put this recording also on YouTube so that those who can't attend today because of any Sunday schedule, they also can enjoy this CME afterwards. So Suvarna Magar, she is working as a geneticist in MGM, and very sincere, very hardworking. As I told everyone in our installation ceremony, she has done a wonderful thing for the subspecialty chapters. She has taken an initiative to start a website for geneticsedu.com, where all the subspecialties have shared their common cases and FAQs. So it is very useful for doctors and even parents and the children. So I will ask Suvarna to start your case. We are very eager to listen you, Suvarna. So
thank you so much for the kind words, ma'am. So a very good morning to all the respected teachers, mentors in Aurangabad Academy of Pediatrics, my friends, colleagues and students. At the outset, I am very thankful to Khandelwal sir and Sandhya ma'am for giving me this opportunity, and I congratulate both. And I am also humbled that AAP is celebrating Rare Disease Day in such a wonderful manner, that all the specialties and pediatricians are coming together for rare diseases. It's a big thing happening in Aurangabad. So I will just start with my short case. This is the question to the audience: which is the rarest of rare disease, which has become one of the common disease today? Someone, you can unmute and answer.
Downs.
No. Okay. Shall I give the answer? Yeah. So it's corona. I tried to search this coronavirus infection. It's not in GHAI, it's not in PG textbook, and even Nelson I could not find. Only microbiology book has mentioned about the coronavirus. And one of the rarest disease has become one of the common and most talked disease on this earth right now. So it's a big learning lesson for all of us. Trends of the diseases are changing, and we as a healthcare professional must equip ourselves with recent times and advances. So we maximally help to the people with various diseases, including rare ones. So let's start with the case. This girl currently 2 years and 8 months. She came to me at 4 months of age. She's born of consanguineous marriage, and mother noticed that she has reduced visual response, hearing response, and even she was not able to hold the neck. So global developmental delay, and child was floppy. That is what mother noticed. Birth history was not significant. She did not require any convulsions. She did not have any convulsions or required hospitalizations for any sorts. And there was no family history of similar complaints. On examination, anthropometry was absolutely in the normal range. There was no dysmorphism, a good looking girl, and without any neurocutaneous markers. On systemic examination, there was hypotonia, hyporeflexia, and the head lag was present, and other systemic examination was normal. So initial impression was she is a floppy infant under evaluation. So this is simply one slide on approach to floppy infant. Floppy strong, and we say floppy weak. So strong is basically though the child has hypotonia, power is preserved here, and here the power is also less, and there is severe hypotonia in floppy weak. So when we have early infancy, floppy strong infants, where there is not really much paucity of movements, child still moves the limbs, but overall it's a hypotonic. So we call this as upper motor neuron disorders, and obviously some other features can be there. CT MRI brain will show probable hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy or CNS malformation. And we call this as another cause is central hypotonia. Means any underlying genetic disease like Down syndrome or microdeletion syndrome, or even other single gene diseases like Ehlers-Danlos, cutis laxa. This can have central hypotonia because of underlying genetic disease. So we identify that with different genetic tests like karyotyping, FISH, microarray, etc. When we have a floppy weak infant, that there is auriflexia, severe hypotonia, so we suspect that there is lower motor neuron type of disorder, or we call this as peripheral hypotonia. Then we can do for CPK total DNA studies, EMG, electromyography, and muscle biopsy, which can help identify the congenital muscular dystrophies, myopathies, and myotonic dystrophies. And second cause is for identifying nerve-related disease, neuropathies. So we can do nerve conduction velocity biopsies and DNA studies. One example is spinal muscular atrophy. So considering this child without any dysmorphism and floppy with global developmental delay, so it was suspected that one of the underlying genetic condition tried to rule out myopathy. CPK was normal. SMN gene mutation, though there the social and language milestones are preserved, and it's only predominant motor delay. She was found to be carrier for SMA with heterozygous deletion of exon 7 and 8. And nerve conduction velocity study was also done, but it was inconclusive. TSH was normal. So the child went back after I told that we need to go ahead with further DNA studies, as it's a consanguineous marriage. My differential was more of a single gene defect, and was also advised for MRI, though it was not showing any telltale signs of upper motor, but because of global developmental delay, that was also asked. Child then at 6 months complained of black colored malodorous urine passage intermittently once in a week, but it was only like a daily event at the age of 8 months, when she also followed with nephrologist. Urine porphobilinogen, black color urine, there are very few causes for it, and one is porphyria and second is alkaptonuria. Both were normal, and for these diseases it's not a typical manifestation of global developmental delay. So in both, the children are developmentally normal. But still we did not have clue for what is the black color, the child with global developmental delay. So the child has malodorous urine and different color. I sent for TMS and urine GCMS. Meanwhile, MRI brain was also done, and it showed subcortical white matter, gliotic foci in frontal and parietal lobes. And EEG was recently done, though there was no history of convulsions. It was abnormal, and she was on anticonvulsant. So her tandem mass spectrometry report was normal, but urine gas chromatography (GCMS) showed elevation in excretion of 4-hydroxybutyric acid, 2-deoxytetanoic acid, adipic acid, glutaric. These are dicarboxylic acid. So this profile can be seen in succinic semialdehyde dehydrogenase deficiency (SSADH). Her GCMS profile was repeated twice for confirming, and the findings whenever there was black urine, we sent it twice, and same profile was seen both the times. So we got the next generation sequencing based DNA analysis done, and this child was diagnosed as having likely pathogenic, means very much positive of the disease. She was homozygous variant in ALDH5A1 gene in exon 4, codon 701, where C is replaced by T, and it was positive of succinic semialdehyde dehydrogenase deficiency, SSADH deficiency. This is a very, very rare. There is no prevalence known, and such a rare disease is diagnosed from our region. And just towards the basics, so it's a neurotransmitter metabolic pathway defect. So glutamic acid is an amino acid which gets converted to GABA, and GABA transaminase gets to succinic semialdehyde, and this is then converted to by SSADH enzyme to succinic acid. Succinic acid is a basic metabolite utilized in Krebs cycle and then in mitochondria for energy creation. But when there is deficiency of this SSADH, this child will have increased levels of GABA. GABA being an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it has more of a effect on mood, and this child was not very expressive, and she used to lie quiet or was not interactive. So more of a social and language delay was noticed for her in later. So this deficiency leads to abnormal accumulation of the compound, this succinic semialdehyde, and then this semialdehyde goes second metabolic pathway, and gamma hydroxybutyric acid (GHB) is accumulated, which is can be found out in GCMS profile. So it's a very rare autosomal recessive disease with unknown prevalence. Vigabatrin is an anti-epileptic of choice if convulsions are present. So because it is an irreversible inhibitor of GABA transaminase enzyme, it inhibits the formation of succinic semialdehyde. So one of the most sorted out drug for this. Because we have diagnosis, we can start her on this, as recently she has convulsion. And how is the prognosis further? So there is a lot of literature in the Western world, and most of the children will achieve milestones and will be left with mild to severe intellectual disability, and she will need neurological monitoring and supportive treatment. So it's not a chronic progressive disease, but she will be left with intellectual disability. So only one case report from India in 2020, and that's from CMC Vellore. And this child presented as metabolic stroke. It was a novel presentation. Stroke is never a presentation for SSADH deficiency. It's always like global developmental delay and intellectual disability. And there can be MRI findings also. And our case was never reported phenotype of black colored urine. So it's again a novel presentation. We have to go further to find out the reason why she presented as black colored urine. So I think this was an interesting case, and from the region of Marathwada, we are able to share this knowledge to the global platform, to the natural history of this disease. So I'm very happy that this case got diagnosed. So take home message: any child with global developmental delay, primary metabolic screening is must, especially early infancy. Secondary metabolic screening with tandem mass spectrometry and urine GCMS is required. It's a very cost-effective test. As a pediatrician, we always do the primary glucose, lactate, ammonia, and urine ketones, and to find out acidosis as ABG. We all do that, and more we have to resort now after GLAC to TMS and GCMS. So why it is cost effective? Just in 5,000, more than 50 treatable genetic diseases are diagnosed in one blood spot and urine drop. and it will be a great help if we can find treatable genetic diseases out of it. MRI brain can give anatomical diagnosis. So as a pediatrician, we definitely want to get MRI brain done for such a children with global developmental delay or neurological symptoms. So it gives an anatomical impression of what is the lesion, where is the where is the effect, but it cannot be a replacement for biochemical test. So biochemical abnormalities will only be picked up on TMS and urine GCMS, plasma amino acids, CSF amino acids. So MRI brain, if it comes normal, still the child can have biochemical abnormality. That is what I want to suggest. Getting a genetic diagnosis helps in proper counseling, future surveillance, future reproductive choices for the parents. So there was only one normal child, so the parents may want another child, and they want to make sure they have a normal child. So prenatal testing can be done based on this child's DNA report. And fourth is this next generation sequencing based DNA testing is a boon in today's era, as this test gives exact diagnosis, satisfaction to the physician to help the child completely, and it is also it's a rewarding for physician also if we get to the core of the diagnosis, and we are also contributing to this natural history of these rare diseases. When we diagnose them, follow them, and see what is happening to them with treatment, or some of them maybe having no treatment at present, but which will definitely be coming as gene therapies and advances in genetics are getting really fast. So that's all. I think I'm not mentioned about any commoner diseases. So there are many amino acidopathies and organic acidemias diagnosed in last 3 years in MGM, more than 200 TMS, GCMS sends, and 40 children diagnosed with different IEMs, inborn errors of metabolism. And this was an interesting case as neurometabolic metabolic disorder, where it's a neurotransmitter disease. So I thought it's a really interesting case. Thank you so much all for patiently listening.
Yes, thank you so much, Suvarna. It was really a rare of rare cases, rarest of the rare case, and it's prestigious for us in Aurangabad. We are now diagnosing with the help of all subspecialties such a rare diseases. Congratulations from all of you. And next is my turn. I will not go in much detail. It's a clinical description of an interesting case. We have less time for each speaker. We have attributed 10 minutes only. So I will go ahead. I will share my screen.
Sandhya.
Yes, sir.
Question answers will be at last, or?
Question answers will be at the last, sir. Yes. Yes, yes.
150 तुमचे चिल्लर 200 द्यायला तुम्हाला 50 तुम्ही 200 दिले ना मला चिल्लर सर तर ओपीडी झाली सकाळी 70ची तर त्याच्यातले 50 तुम्हाला येऊ लागले तर मग आता 150
mute. I have muted everyone. I don't know why this is happening. Please mute everyone. I request. So should I start my case? I will start with my case. She is a 4 years 5 months. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's 4 years 5 months female child, presented to us with PV bleeding since last 3 days. Her mother noticed bilateral breast development since last 2 to 3 months and scanty axillary hair growth since last 1 week. So it was a very rapid progression of puberty in a girl 4 years and 5 months old. The child was not gaining adequate height and was limping since last 1.5 years, and she was taking treatment for that, but without much effect. No history of irritability, headache, visual defects or convulsions, no history of head injury. So there was no any symptoms suggestive of central precocious puberty. Her milestones were absolutely within normal limits. In birth history, she was a full-term normal delivery, product of non-consanguineous marriage, delivered by vertex presentation. Child cried immediately after birth. There was no birth asphyxia. Her birth weight was 2.7 kg and no any adverse event happening in NICU. Her family history was absolutely normal. She was having one elder brother, 7 years, and he was also absolutely normal. On examination, her height was 90 centimeter, within 3rd to 10th centile. Her weight was 10.7 kg on 5th centile. Child was limping on right side. There was no goiter. There were no any caffeolate spots. Her sexual maturity rate was B3, P1, A2, and M+. She was having bilateral breast development, no pubic hair, some scanty axillary hair, and her menses started just 3 days back. Her systemic examination was absolutely normal. So this is the child. We can clearly see the bilateral breast development. There was no only breast bud, but it was a elevated hound of breast bilaterally. There were scanty axillary hair also. If we see her legs, there is a clear limb length discrepancy what we can perceive from this photograph. So we did her x-rays. Actually, she was having some x-rays. We again repeated her some x-rays, and we can clearly see here there is a honeycomb-like appearance in the upper end of tibia, which is also expanding. This is the major patch of cavity-like thing seen in the upper femur. So her left femur was absolutely normal, and on other side, the femur was showing honeycomb appearance on the upper end and some osteolytic lesions in the shaft and in the lower end of tibia. This we can see clearly in this photo. So we further investigated her biochemically. Her fasting FSH was very low, suppressed FSH, 0.08 microunits per ml. Her LH was also suppressed, below 0.09, very, very suppressed. And surprisingly, her estrogen was very high. For her age, it should be below 10 picogram per ml, and it was very high, 745 picogram per ml. This was about her pubertal workup. So we did workup for her limping gait. Ionic calcium was normal. Her phosphorus was slightly on lower side. Her alkaline phosphatase was somewhat raised. So looking at this biochemistry, phosphorus was high. So we did tubular reabsorption of phosphate. We have to do urinary creatinine, urinary phosphorus, serum creatinine and serum phosphorus for taking tubular reabsorption of proteins. And it is the indication how much phosphate is lost in the urine. So normally it should be above 87 to 88%, and in this case it was 67%. So clearly she was losing a lot of phosphate in her urine. So in this case, diagnosis was very clear, McCune-Albright syndrome. Actually, the classic syndrome is having a triad of autonomous endocrinopathies. We have to have caffeolate spots, polyostotic fibrous dysplasia, and some of the endocrinopathy like hyperthyroidism or growth hormone excess or Cushing syndrome or PTH excess or maybe precocious puberty. But in this case, we were not having any caffeolate spots. But so this was a rare case to have McCune-Albright without any caffeolate spots, having monostotic fibrous dysplasia in the left femur, and along with that, the girl was having activating mutation in the GNAS gene. This GS alpha subunit receptor proteins, this subunit is shared by so many hormones, that is TSH, FSH, GHRH, ACTH, and PTH. So whenever we get the mutation in GS alpha subunit of receptor protein, we can get autonomous activation of all these endocrinal glands. So many a times, most commonly we get caffeolate spots, precocious puberty, and polyostotic fibrous dysplasia. But sometimes we can get hyperthyroidism, can get growth hormone excess, can get Cushing syndrome, and can get PTH excess also. This syndrome is usually not seen much commonly in the boys, very, very common in girls. So what is the treatment of this disease? Here, we could get precocious puberty along with the monocytic fibrous dysplasia. So now we have to treat both for her precocious puberty also and for monocytic fibrous dysplasia also. So this precocious puberty is peripheral precocious puberty. As we saw, LH and FSH both are very, very suppressed because of E2. Estrogen is very high, which is getting secreted from the autonomous ovaries. There are multiple cysts in the ovaries and they are acting autonomously. So this peripheral estrogen usually suppresses FSH and LH. So both the gonadotropins are highly suppressed, and we can get the classical picture of peripheral precocious puberty, which is incomplete isosexual peripheral precocious puberty. And along with this phosphorus is getting lost in the urine. So what in hypophosphatemic rickets we can get, and along with it fibrous dysplasia of one or more bone. So this was that way rare case of McCune-Albright, and then we have to take care of both these elements. So for precocious puberty, we have to block her estrogen secretion. So the most common treatment and most safe treatment which is suggested for McCune-Albright syndrome is aromatase inhibitor. There are three generations of aromatase inhibitors. They block the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. So we have anastrozole, letrozole, and testosterone. Testosterone we can't use in a girl child. So letrozole and anastrozole are the drugs of choice. Anastrozole has proved since so many years to be a successful treatment in McCune-Albright. So since last 1.5 years, our child is also on anastrozole tablet, 1 milligram per day. And after starting the treatment, after 1 month, she got regression of her bilateral breast. There was no any spotting or PV bleed in last 1.5 years. So anastrozole has taken care of her precocious puberty. And for her monocytic fibrous dysplasia, a lot of phosphorus she is losing in her urine. So we have to give continuous phosphate supplementation. Usually we give in the dose of 25 to 40 milligram per kg. We have to give in the multiple aliquots phosphorus, because if we give in the high dose, she can have loose motions, and that much phosphorus will again stimulate the PTH. And since PTH can cause phosphate loss in the urine, it can aggravate her disease. So whenever we are supplementing any phosphorus supplementation like Adphos or any Julie solution or any other solution, we have to give in small aliquots. So the child is on the sachet, and she takes 1 sachet of 250 milligram per day in a divided doses. And her limping is also getting controlled, and her growth is also better. Usually this treatment we have to continue for around 4 to 6 years. And when she comes at around peripubertal age, we can stop at least aromatase inhibitors, anastrozole, and we have to supplement her for lifelong phosphorus supplementation. So this was an interesting case of McCune-Albright. We will have any queries or any discussion about this case after end of our session.
Good morning, everyone. And it's really an opportunity to present a case today here with all specialties and senior pediatricians and teachers being there. My case is a girl who had presented at the age of 3 months. She was born out of consanguineous marriage, second born, birth weight was average, and there's a history of admission on day 4 for fever and lethargy. No metabolic derangements were recorded that time. The cause of fever was not found, treated as sepsis. Child was fine after that. She presented at 3 months of age for poor head hold. There was no social smile, so developmental delay. There was no history of seizure or any other medical illness. On examination, child was hypotonic. There was no eye contact, though perception of light was there. There was no focal neurological deficit. Her reflexes were depressed. She predominantly had axial hypotonia. There was no neurocutaneous markers, and her head size was appropriate. So at this point, she is a hypotonic child with some developmental delay. Being consanguineous marriage, and there was a history of one sibling, that is the first child died at the age of 1 year with fever. He had history of dry skin and query-convulsions. So first differential which came into mind was biotinidase deficiency because of the skin manifestation, developmental delay, and probably seizures when he died. So suspicion was a neurometabolic disorder, but the initial screen and the investigations were normal. MRI brain was normal, fundus was normal. The metabolic screen, routine metabolic screen, TMS, GCMS was again normal with biotin days. So we couldn't diagnose anything at this point. The child was not regular child for follow-up, but at the age of 12 to 16 months, she had repeated episodes of febrile illness and the developmental delay persisted. The parents during this period noticed that probably the child doesn't sense pain, because whenever the child was admitted, putting IV line or giving IV injections or IM injections, she was not crying. So that was one point which parents noticed at around 9 months to 10 months. But still, we could not correlate anything at this point. At 1.5 years, that is at 1.5 years, she presented with self-mutilation. There was biting when she had teeth. She started biting her lips. There was non-healing oral ulcers, finger bites, multiple injuries were there, and the skin became dry by this time. So here we had some differentials whether we are dealing with Leishman syndrome because of self-mutilating problem, but the fever was not explained, and she was not irritable as usually a Leishman child by this time would be very irritable. There were some behavior problems, but not like Leishman. So relative was another because she had history of multiple episodes of unexplained fever, PO. She has been treated for that. But still we could not come to one conclusion. At the same year in the winter, she presented with dry gangrene. So she had multiple patches of gangrene on her mainly fingers and toes. Those were auto-amputated, and as the child stays at remote place, so they could come only for dressing once or twice during 8 days, but she was okay after that. So here we did now conduction study, which again came normal. Serum uric acid came normal because we thought of Leishman syndrome. Finally, for 2 years, we couldn't diagnose anything in spite of telling repeatedly to the parents. They could get the genetic study done at the age of 2 years. And we found that there is a mutation which was homozygous for congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. So this was a homozygous mutation, and it was matching with the case. So we took it as pathogenic mutation. Parents were tested for that, and both the parents are carriers for that. Neurotropic tyrosine kinase receptor, that is NTRK1, is important for the development of the central and the peripheral nerve system, mainly the pathway. So these children, they usually have insensitivity to pain. The girl, now she's almost 3 years old, and almost she does have developmental delay. Child, the speech delay is there, but being the very simple family, they could take good care of her. Like she is always in this attire, full dress, shoes, which are always been there to prevent the injuries. And even the oral care they have been taking very well. So this child is now able to run, as we can see, and there is some speech also. But in the future, we don't know when she can get a severe episode of PO or some injury. So congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis is also known as HSAN, that is sensory autonomic neuropathy type 4. It is characterized by absence of normal responses to painful stimuli, anhidrosis, recurrent episode of hyperthermia, self-mutilating behavior, and intellectual disabilities. When we searched the literature for her gangrene, which was little unusual, we could find that they do get significant hypothermia in the cold environment. So that could be the cause of it was like chilblains in her, or because of the regular routine winter which we have, she could get the chilblains because of her condition. So again, the treatment remains only supportive. The children usually they do have, as they grow up into the adulthood, they are known to get multiple fractures, severe injuries, and developmental delay will persist. So there are 5 types of HSAN. The first type usually present in the second decade, but other 4 types usually are seen in the childhood. Type 3 and 4 are usually seen commonly in the pediatric age group, though both are very rare. The 3 is really day where we do get an autonomic disturbances. Children usually present with fever, but the type 4 has the severe manifestation of self-mutilation. The diagnosis now initially, previously, the now biopsy and all they used to differentiate between these type, but because of availability of the genetic testing, we can diagnose these types by doing the clinical exome sequencing. So this was just a child which we could diagnose only test because the clinically we couldn't come to one conclusion. I thank you all the organizers.
Thank you so much, Madhavi. It was a very nice case, really a rare case. We haven't seen such a case in even general pediatric practice. So nice presentation also. So should we move ahead? Varsha, are you ready? Can you share your slide?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Sandhya Konpalle and Dr. Shyam Khandelwal, sir, the new team going in full swing. And this is a really proud feeling that this is the first time we are conducting the rare diseases day, and such a good colleagues of mine presenting very nice cases. So this is my case. This is a 7 months old child. This is the neurologist practice common that the child comes with the either motor delay or convulsions. There are 2 types of patients we are getting. So this child came at 7 months of age, and this is the second born of non-consanguineous marriage. There is a first female child which is normal. There is no positive family history, no positive birth history. There were no seizures. The absolute complaint was only mild motor delay. So this is the child. You can see that the child is reacting well. There is partially a neck holding. So there was no microcephaly or macrocephaly. The child had good eye contact. The reflexes were elicited. There is mild hypotonia. So this child was asked to have a follow-up, asked for the physiotherapy and review after 3 months. And this time the only investigation was told that we will require an MRI if the child persists to have motor delay. Now this is the first visit, and then they lost the follow-up, and you can see that the child comes after, this is usual story, the child comes after very long gap. So 5 to 6 months after the child came at around 13-14 months of age, this visit the child came with the myoclonus, yeah, and there are jerks, and you can see, and this child had some visual complaints. You can see the posture. The child had severe hypotonia. There were myoclonic jerks. And the child was regressed, and at this time we were aggressive, and we asked the parents to have a investigation in details. As the child had myoclonics and seizures, we did the EEG, but EEG was not as bad for myoclonus. It was just slowing. The slowing was predominant. There were some spikes. So we did the neuroimaging also, and in neuroimaging we found that the thalami and the basal ganglia were having some signals. There were hyperintensity which was there in the periventricular white matter. It is T2 image, and this is FLAIR. We can see this white matter hyperintensity was just started. So this is initial stages of white matter involvement along with basal ganglia involvement. So the DD which was kept in mind was there is some there is a neuroregression. The child was having, if you can see this face, there is no coarse faces, there was no macro or microcephaly. The child was losing milestones, and there was jerks. So some metabolic disorder or some storage we are dealing with. So we did go for the fundus examination, as there was visual complaints. You can see this fundus. This is an optic disc, and this is a cherry red spot. This cherry red spot was seen, and then we had so many differentials with the child. We had a child which has an age of onset of complaints less than 1 year. There was a initial motor delay along with the psychosocial regression, then seizures, visual loss, but there was no hepatosplenomegaly, and the facies was normal. On MRI, we got the basal ganglion white matter abnormality. We had a cherry red spot. We had a EEG abnormality. So considering all this, we had enlisted the possibilities what we are dealing with. we can it can be a gangliosidosis, it can be infantile NCL, it can be Tay-Sachs disease, Sandoff's MLD. For all this, they were the similar the complaints and the features can be seen. So whenever we are dealing with a case of neuroregression with some MRI changes and some cherry red spot, either we are dealing with some white matter disorder or gray matter disorder. Now in this case, we are dealing with white matter also and gray matter also. There are a long list of differentiating how we differentiate white matter disorder and gray matter disorder. But the important thing is, in gray matter disorder, seizures and microcephaly start first, and in white matter disorders, the global developmental delay, hypotonia, and this initial hypotonia and then spasticity and diminished reflexes, they do occur first. So whenever now in this case, we were dealing with something which is having basal ganglia hyperintense with neuroregression. So we are probably dealing with either GM1 gangliosidosis or GM2 gangliosidosis, because the child was not fitting in any other clinical and radiological correlation. So now after a long visits, 2 or 3 visits, this is the important sign the parents missed, and then we could elicit, and this is the important sign which we really see from our MBBS days. This is hyperacusis. So they were thinking that there were convulsions, but this was really hyperacusis. So we could go for the investigations, enzyme studies. So we did the leukocyte enzyme activity. So this is the beta hexosaminidase A, which was low with 1.4, and these 2 reference enzymes were normal. And then we could say that this was a Tay-Sachs disease. And we did the genetics for this, and the genetics turned out to be hexa gene positive on exon 10, and it was autosomal recessive, and this was likely pathogenic. So this is the this was the gene which was there. We could find out in the literature that only less than 200 mutations we have till date we have found. This the last paper was published on 2019, and India, we have seen the papers by Dr. Jayesh Seth, that more than 70% of Tay-Sachs disease genetics, they are having novel mutations, so they are not seen in literature anywhere in the world. So this is the autosomal recessive inheritance, but in our case, there was no parental consanguinity. So we have to keep in mind that always in all the storage or neuroregressive diseases, there cannot be a consanguineous marriage. This hexa gene codes for the it is there on the chromosomes on the alpha subunit of the enzyme beta hexosaminidase A. So we are dealing with the now Tay-Sachs disease. As such, for Tay-Sachs disease, we have diagnosed, we manage the seizures, we manage the day-to-day his challenges by symptomatic management. We all know there is no such a enzyme replacement therapy for this, and this beta hexosaminidase deficiency will always lead to ganglioside storage, and it will cause neuronal damage, which will lead to myelin loss, and neuronal damage will cause convulsions, and this myelin loss will cause the hypotonia, and the initial hypotonia and then spasticity. So this story doesn't stop here. Now this doing almost this with the child was around 3 years of age. They were thinking of the next child. We did the parental carrier screening. So the carrier screen was positive for both, and the same gene was identified in the parents. So now they wanted to have a next pregnancy. So we did the amniocentesis at 16 weeks, and the Korean villus could not be done because we did it on the 16 weeks of, and then the report is still awaited. And we will, so the take home message from my case is the neuroregression, there are so many cases we are getting, but they are unattended. The genetics is not done, considering is that it is very costly investigation, but it will change the future of the next pregnancy. And we will know that what are the mutations in our country and in our population, and it will improve our database of genetics. And these cases can be seen in non-consanguineous marriages too. The Tay-Sachs disease has genetic basis, and the most of them are novel mutations. The genetic testing is must. We all should encourage in all those low molecular, this IM and neuroregression cases, that will help us for the to prevent the burden of these cases. So thank you. This was my short case, and many of us are getting these cases, but important message I wanted to give is we have to find it what is the gene responsible, and proactively do the prenatal testing in the next pregnancy. Thank you, all my seniors, colleagues, and the AAP team.
Thanks, Varsha, for a wonderful case and wonderful presentation. Back to back two neuro cases we have attended. Any question, you can add it in chat box and we will take it at the end of session, or the session will be free to ask any question after we finish every case. So next is I think Dr. Vishal. So Vishal, are you ready? Varsha, you stop sharing, then Vishal will share. Yes.
Am I visible?
Yes, yes.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for allowing us to share our few rare experiences on this day of rare disorders. It is really a rare day. My case is a case of foot drop secondary to HSMA. And I am going to explain you whether we have any solutions for that. Our patient was a 17 years old girl born out of non-consanguineous marriage. She was a third child, Kirti. She came to us with bilateral high steppage gait, and parents' concern was related to her marriage. On examination, she had bilateral foot drop, and there was no significant sensory deficit, but motor deficit was very significant. That too more in the distal involvement, with foot dorsiflexor weakness and aortus were weak. Reflexes were diminished or sluggish, and more of a distal involvement than proximal involvement. When we examined her power, she had tibialis posterior of grade 4, tibialis anterior grade 3, and peroneal were very weak of grade 1 power. So when we did gait analysis, it was her gait analysis. She had bilateral foot drop gait with dynamic equinovarus feet. You can see that she is walking with in-toeing gait and dragging her feet while walking. As well as she has atrophy of calf muscles. So what helped us to diagnose? It was detailed clinical analysis, neurological examination. We went ahead with EMGs and NCV to confirm our diagnosis, and genetic workup was done. On her EMG and NCV studies, we got these findings. MCs were severely reduced, and she had evoked CMAPs with marked dispersed A waves. Her genetic study was done, and it proved out to be Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. It was type 1 disease with significant neurological involvement. So what is HSMN? It is a neurological disorder which is an inherited disorder with peripheral neuropathies. These are slowly progressive weakness, and characteristically they have muscle atrophies. Usually they present somewhere in the adolescent age or late childhood. These are autosomal dominant inheritance pattern, autosomal recessive inheritance pattern. Rarely we see X-linked pattern as well, but autosomal dominant is more common. And we find mutation in chromosome 1 and 17. There are different types of HSMN, of which she was a type of, she was of type 1, 1A. These are the classifications for HSMN. What are peculiar features of HSMN to prove our clinical diagnosis? They usually have weakness, fatigability. Rarely they present with pain, diminished reflexes, and onset is in early childhood or young adulthood, with motor involvement more prominent than sensory involvement. Visual and auditory symptoms are there, but they are seen very rarely. On examination, you will find high arch feet, hammer toes, foot drops, and foot deformities. They may be fixed deformities or they may be dynamic deformities. Rarely you can see scoliosis in more profound cases or spinal deformities. What helps us in diagnosis, as I already explained you, we need detailed clinical evaluation. We need to see for muscle weakness, which muscles are involved, whether there is any atrophy, whether there are any sensory changes. Then we need to do EMG NCVs and confirmatory diagnosis with genetic testing. What treatment options are available? Till date, no confirmatory medical management is available. No drug is found to be that effective in, but there are other modalities which will help to improve the outcome. Physiotherapy, it will avoid fracture formation, it will avoid contractures, braces to improve gait, foot drop gait, and surgery. Prognosis, many times it is asked by the parents that how much life-threatening is it? It is not life-threatening. Of course, they do have progression of the disease, which gets reduced after certain years of the age, but they do have normal lifespan. And the progression halts at some stage of life? No, it doesn't halt. The progression is there, but it gets very slow after particular age. There is no defined criteria for the age, but you can establish it with clinical analysis and EMG studies. Whether surgical management is recommended in those cases, many times we feel that since it is a progressive disorder, then surgery will help or it won't help. But with the studies, it has been proved that if the surgeries are performed at appropriate time in early phases of the disease, it at least halts the progression or it delays the progression and decreases the incidence of deformities or disabilities. What we did in this particular case was triple tendon transfer. We call it as bridal process, in which we use 3 tendons, peroneus longus, tibialis posterior, and tibialis anterior. We do triple tendon tenodosis with the aim to achieve foot dorsiflexion to correct foot drop and improve her gait with correction of equinus or dynamic forefoot varus deformity. But the only surgery is not the solution. After that, we need very aggressive rehabilitation for this patient, because we need to train the tendons which are transferred or which are placed from one place to the other place. So she underwent aggressive physiotherapy, muscle stimulations, and strengthening exercises. This was a surgery done in very much cosmetic ways with 4 small incisions of around 1.5 centimeters, in which we transferred peroneus from the lateral side to the anterior of the tibia to give lateral columnar support, and we reinforced it with tibialis anterior and tibialis posterior tendon. You can see the foot now on the table, which is very well corrected and in neutral position. So this is what we achieved on table. This is the peroneus tendon which I have transferred and which is giving us good lateral column support and foot dorsiflexion. And it has been augmented with tibialis anterior and tibialis posterior tendon. This is her post-op gait. You can see the right foot is been operated first, left foot is just now operated. If you see at the right foot, you will see that she is walking with good plantigrade foot compared to the left foot, which is still she is dragging. She has adequate foot dorsiflexion. And in this video, you can see that she is actively dorsiflexing her foot with adequate power. So what we could achieve in this case with the tendon transfer is good plantigrade dynamic dorsiflexing foot and the foot which is clearing of the ground while walking. She has underwent second side very recently. So in my case, what I want to convey is that good clinical evaluation for the selection of the patient for surgery with proper counseling of the parents for aggressive rehabilitation, good compliance from the patient is very important in these cases. And if we want to have a successful outcome of these cases, we need to counsel the parents regarding post-op protocols and post-op rehabilitation. So thank you for allowing me to share my case, and please do take precautions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vishal. That way, orthopedic cases, general pediatrician, usually we don't face such cases, or maybe we are having very less knowledge about the thing. So nice to listen from you, such a rare case. It will give another perspective to see the ortho cases in general pediatric OPD. So thanks for that nice presentation. And I think Pankaj is the next speaker. We will take the questions after end of the session, and I will request Pankaj to start his presentation.
Thanks, Vishal. To take case clinically, otherwise I was feeling out of league of all these experts who were talking so lucidly on genetics, and another thing was neurology. Neurology and genetics were never my cup of tea. So my case is more of a clinical based. These are the cases probably I am seeing almost every year 2 to 3 patients. Relatively rare disorder. 5-month male infant presents with loose motions and vomiting with mild dehydration. Child was admitted outstation, received IV fluid, supportive treatment. Loose motions, vomiting stopped, dehydration got corrected. But then patient developed periorbital puffiness. So till that time, urine output was not monitored well. And then when urine bag was collected, it was found that there is no urine output in last 6 hours. So trial of Lasix was given as dehydration was already corrected, and lab were sent. And this time, lab showed already raised creatinine and rising potassium. So looking at oligoanuria with rising creatinine, patient was referred to Aurangabad. When we went in history, ANC scan was normal. What we were looking at ANC scan was any hydronephrosis or obstructive uropathy. Child was full term, normal birth weight. There was a history of 3rd degree consanguinity and one cousin sibling death at 6 months. The cause probably not known, but parents were telling it is secondary to some renal cause. Otherwise, child was well grown and development was normal. On examination, child was irritable, lethargic, there was tachycardia, tachypnea, signs of volume overload were already there with basal crepitations and hepatomegaly. We repeated lab. Here HB was 8.2, platelets normal. Creatinine further rose to 7.2, and there was severe metabolic acidosis. So what are the possibilities at this point? In view of history of dehydration, definitely acute tubular necrosis remains one possibility, but there was not severe dehydration, but sometimes we do see renal shutdown in even mild dehydration when child has received NSAIDs, particularly ibuprofen, or sometimes ACE inhibitors like enalapril for some other cardiac causes. So dehydration with NSAIDs or ACE inhibitors is a catastrophic for kidney. Renal calculus, yes, it is a definite possibility. Probably what number of stones I have seen in 2 years of my fellowship, presently I am seeing in 3 months of my practice. So the number of stones are very common in pediatric, and we see a lot of patients presenting with bilateral obstructive renal calculus and requiring dialysis or immediate surgical intervention. So renal calculi definitely remains one possibility. Congenital obstructive uropathy, unlikely, as ANC scan was normal, urine stream is good, and child is well grown. Bilateral renal vascular thrombosis, less likely at this age with trivial dehydration. So at this point, we kept a possibility that there might be either ATN, because child might have received some antipyretics, or might be bilateral renal calculus. We did a sonography, and sonography more or less straight away gave us a diagnosis. If you see kidney, it's a very bright, as if whole kidney is flooded with nephrocalcinosis. There is hardly any differentiation between cortex and medulla, and it's brighter. It's like almost calculi forming in the whole of the kidney. And this is a classic finding at this age. If you see the pointed area, kidneys are visible on X-ray for a 5-month child. For me, at this point, there remains only one diagnosis, and that is primary hyperoxaluria type 1. Because there is so much significant calcification in both kidneys that they are visible on normal X-ray KUV without any dye or any different medium. So at this point, so our probable diagnosis was primary hyperoxaluria type 1. We decided to send serum oxalate level. Can we do urine oxalate level at this level? No. When child is oligoanuric, then he is passing only 5 to 10 ml of urine in a day. Urine oxalate is not a good test to pick up any diagnosis. But oxalate is not available in Aurangabad, so it sample went to Hyderabad. Till that time, looking at his condition in view of volume overload, hyperkalemia, anuric child, peritoneal dialysis was started. Initially rapid cycles, which helped in removing extra fluid and potassium, and then shifted to regular cycles. With this, child stabilized, irritability, volume overload, hyperkalemia, distress, everything settled. And to our surprise, serum oxalate came 0.59, which is normal. So have we missed the boat? Is it something else? No. Initial phase, serum oxalate may take time to rise. But in renal tubules, with dehydration, oxalate may precipitate quite early. So at this age, serum oxalate is not always a positive finding. So how do we work up? In view of, with availability of genetic tests, probably biopsy is outdated nowadays for diagnosing of primary hyperoxaluria. But problem with that, genetic tests take almost 3 to 4 weeks for reports to get available. And for parents, it becomes very difficult whether to continue or discontinue. So biopsy is like classical. There are a lot of crystals, or all tubules are almost flooded with oxalate crystals. At this point, we were very sure that this is a primary hyperoxaluria, and we have sent genetic tests. So what is primary hyperoxaluria? It's an autosomal recessive disorder which has two types. Type 1 is AGT deficiency and type 2 GRHPR deficiency. Type 2 is a milder variant which generally presents late, and they can have really a good quality of life if managed aggressively. Now, so we'll focus on type 1, which generally present in pediatric population, can manifest in less than 1 year child. It's found in 1 in 1 lakh live births. There is an oxalate overproduction. So the problem is not in the kidney, problem is in liver. But burn is bared by my bechari kidney. So all oxalate crystals get deposited in the renal tubules, and once they have deposited, there is no way to remove them. Once GFR falls below 30 to 50 ml, deposition in other organs starts, particularly bone marrow and almost every vessels, and vascular oxalate deposition causes every system problems. Types which we have commonly encountered with a severe oliguric or anuric renal failure is an infantile type, but there are childhood and onset and adulthood onset also. How do we manage them? Management is obviously high fluid intake, use of citrate, because citrate helps in preventing oxalate precipitation. Diuretics, not furosemide because it causes calciuria. We need to restrict calcium excretion in the urine, so hydrochlorothiazide. There is a good group of hyperoxaluria where pyridoxine helps. Almost 20 to 30% patients of primary hyperoxaluria responds to pyridoxine very well if picked up early. Now there is a calcium oxalate precipitation in renal tubules. Shall we restrict calcium and oxalate? No, because the problem is not with dietary over intake, it is problem with renal tubules. So calcium restriction or oxalate restriction is not recommended. Now the treatment, corrective treatment is practically impossible in our situation. What we need is combined kidney and liver transplant, because transplanting only kidney will not work. Because even if we transplant kidney, liver is at fault. It will continually produce oxalate levels in the height, and further it will compromise renal function. So combined kidney liver transplant is the treatment of choice. Just to summarize in short, when to suspect hyperoxaluria: sudden onset anuria following trivial dehydration in well-grown infant with good urine stream and no obstructing calculus on USG. Or easier option is, whenever anuria, call me. I'm there to help you.
Yes, Vishal, we all know you are there to help us in any renal pediatric cases. and it was a very nice, fully clinically based presentations. Nephrocalcinosis in an infant, particularly such a small infant, 5 months old infant, is just a challenging thing. There are many DDs, and we can have some questions at the end of session. I will like to ask you questions also. So it was a very nice presentation. It will guide us in such sudden anuria in such a small infant. Our next speaker is Dr. Shraddha Chandak. She is a hemato-oncologist, and she's practicing at Cape Pond Hospital. I will request Shraddha to share her slides.
Good morning, everyone. And first of all, let me thank Dr. Sandhya ma'am and Khandelwal sir for giving me opportunity to be here in this platform. And today I'm going to present, like, after the talk of all experts, my case is really very simple as compared to them. It's an interesting case of osteoporosis, a rare combo beyond imagination. So this is a 4-month-old male child born of non-consanguineous marriage, second by order of birth, hailing from Andhra Pradesh, full-term normal delivery, and it was a home delivery. Birth weight was 2.2 kg, and baby did not cry immediately after birth, required 3 days of NICU stay. Now he had come to me with the history of not gaining weight since birth, increased irritability since 15 days of life, and delayed cord fall after 15 days of life. There was no other positive history, and developmental history, there was a developmental delay, no head holding, no social smile, and cooing was present. Family history was negative. On examination, there was severe failure to thrive, as we can see in the picture. Weight was just 3.5 kg at 4 months, which is less than third centile. Length is 51 centimeter. Head circumference is 38 centimeter. Pallor was present. So pallor is present, no icterus, no cyanosis, clubbing, lymphadenopathy or edema fit. There was quint present, nystagmus present, AF is wide open, and as we can see, there is a rickettsial rosary, rib beading, parietal bossing, and signs of rickets were present. Per abdomen examination, liver was 6 centimeter below costal margin with span of 9 centimeter. Spleen was 7 centimeter and firm, and on neurological examination, there was generalized hypotonia. So with the history and clinical examination, my differentials were either it is a storage disorder or osteopetrosis. On investigations, we did CBC. There is a pallor. There is leukocytosis with neutrophilic leukocytosis, as we can see, and platelets were low, that is 68,000. So hemoglobin of 8.2, total counts were 57,700, and within 48 hours, they rise up to 75,000 with neutrophilic leukocytosis of 30,000. Peripheral smear did not show any blast, but there were 88 NR, that is nucleated RBC per 100 WBC, which is indicative of stressed marrow or a polychromasia. Platelets were reduced on smear. CRP was negative, LFT, RFT normal, and vitamin D was very low. On radiography, as we can see, there is increased bone density all over the body, and there is clubbing of metaphyses. So this X-ray is typically of osteopetrosis. Ophthalmic workup, there was nystagmus was present, no papilloedema, and BERA was suggestive of bilateral sensory neural hearing loss. So LAD workup. Now everybody will raise their eyebrows that why LAD workup? Because in history there was a point that cord was formed after day 15 of life, and there is a neutrophilic leukocytosis in absence of infection or absence of and there was a leukocytosis but no blast. So I did LAD workup, which is suggestive of 99% neutrophils were positive for CD18 and 11A. But mean fluorescence intensity is reduced. That means there is a qualitative defect in PMN, which was suggestive of LAD, that is leukocyte adhesion deficiency. So next, my plan was to plan NGS. So we managed this child with the supportive treatment and counsel the parents. However, they did not do the NGS and lost to follow. So here I have a case where in a one child, there is a bone problem, that is osteopetrosis, and one is a immunological, that is blood cells problem. So how they are related? Do we have any answer, or two different entities in a same patient? So let's see, LAD, it is an autosomal recessive disease. This is a disorder with impairment in phagocyte adhesion chemotaxis, and there is impairment in ingestion of C3b, that is opsonization of microbes. Now, the genetic cause of LAD is a mutation of beta-2 integrins, that is CD18 molecule. There are three types of LAD as we know. The LAD1, there is defect in the in rolling because the selectins are the problem and not the integrins. And LAD3, it is a qualitative defect, that is defect in the activation of While osteopetrosis, it is autosomal recessive or autosomal dominant. There is impaired osteoclast function, and because of that, there is reduced bone reabsorption and diffuse increase in the bone sclerosis. Now, LAD3, it is nothing but LAD1 variant syndrome, which is associated with recurrent infection, leukocytosis, and bleeding tendencies. Because integrins expression is normal in LAD3, what is defective is inside-out activation of all hematopoietic stem cells, integrins to high affinity binding site. And the reason is there is mutation in this FERMT, that is fermitin-3 gene, which is located on chromosome 11q13, and the result is there is absence of kindlin-3 protein product. Now, what is this fermitin gene? These have these three subdomain F0, F1, F2, and F3, and the final protein product of this gene is kindlin-3 protein. Now, this kindlin-3 or fermitin-3 gene expression is seen in osteoclast, which is important for bone resorption. It is seen on integrin activation and signaling. This fermitin expression is also seen in leukocytes, which is required for firm adhesion under the shear flow, and they are expressed in platelets also, and they are necessary for blood clot formation. So, absence of kindlin-3. So, if they are absent on this osteoclast, there is inactive beta-3 and beta-2 integrins. Defective bone resorption results in osteopetrosis. If kindlin-3 is absent, there is lack of leukocyte adhesions and immune problem. And absence of kindlin-3 on platelet, there is lack of platelet aggregations and bleeding tendencies occur. So these are the case reports all over the world. There are different, like most of the time we see that child had presented with infection, delayed cord fall, bleeding in different studies, and there is mutation in this fermitin gene. In our case, my child had presented with delayed cord fall and osteopetrosis. However, I could not prove it genetically. And the second case, which we have recently seen in Cape Town, this is a 3-month male child born of non-consanguineous marriage, full-term normal delivery, came with pain in right hip joint, inability to move right leg. There is excessive crisis, 15 days of life, and suspected of septic arthritis. USG hip suggestive of some inflammatory pathology, hence antibiotics were given, but there was no relief. And on day 3, he had come with pathological fracture. On examination, this child's weight was 5.5 kg, pallor was present, hepatomegaly of 6 cm, and motor delay was present. There was tenderness and swelling over right hip joint. On CBC, hemoglobin was 8.8, WBC was very high, 32,240 with ANC of 5,480. Platelet were reduced 82,000. Again, the peripheral smear show NRBCs as 25 per 100 WBC, and no blast, platelets were reduced. This is the X-ray image of this child, which is again showing that increased density of bones and suggestive of osteopetrosis. However, unlike the prior child, we could prove the genetic diagnosis of osteopetrosis 4 in this child, whose genetic studies came positive for CLCN7 gene, which is expressed on exon 19, and it was an autosomal recessive. So now we were lucky enough to give the genetic diagnosis to the parents, and which helped us for the prenatal diagnosis for the future pregnancy of the parents. So to conclude, osteopetrosis with LAD, it's rare combination. We should, suspecting 2 different etiologies in a child, we should keep our mind open for any new diagnosis or any new development in a clinical scenario. Hematopoietic stem cell transplant remains the curative option. Supportive management includes treatment like transfusions and infection control. And finally, the genetic diagnosis, genetic counseling, and offering a prenatal diagnosis for a future to the parents is the must. And with this, I would like to thank you everyone for listening to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Shraddha, for such a nice presentation. It's really a rare combination, even if you say it is not rare. Osteopetrosis, we can see in the general pediatric practice, but such a rare combination of that kindling defect and having a combination of leukocyte adhesion defect along with osteopetrosis is really a rare thing. Both of your cases were very nice, and you had a very nice presentation. We will take all the questions. We can get some time, I think maybe 10 to 15 minutes for a last session of question and answer. So quickly, I will request Dr. Viranji to present his case.
Good morning all. Am I audible and visible?
Yes. Yes, audible, visible. You can go ahead.
Thank you. Now, being in orthopedics, Vishal would agree to me. We are obsessive about having a perfect X-ray, having a perfect reduction, having a perfect TKR, having a perfectly executed reconstruction. So orthopedics is obsessed about perfection. But when we came into pediatric orthopedics, we were humbled because we were dealing with many of the cases wherein there was no perfect solution, and it was more of rehabilitation, taking a child from a very bad state to a better state. So presenting my experience about a particular disease, that is OI, where we have tried to come up with a near perfect solution to a very imperfect bone. So basically, this is a journey for all of us, treating that kids from pain towards mobility. So this is something that we know perfectly as of today, that it is inherited, it is heterogeneous. Basically, there is a defect in type 1 collagen, which forms the matrix of the bone. Genetically, it is autosomal dominant, and call 1A1 and 1A2 genes are involved. And because of type 1 collagen problems, there is brittle bone. Incidence is supposed to be 1 in 15,000 to 20,000. What we have been seeing clinically is blue or gray sclera, which are very typical in type 1 OI. Dental involvement is very common in OI. Joints are hypermobile. We have seen few cases where there is abnormal callus formation. It is supposed to be type 5 OI. There is associated hearing impairment, and there are CVS and CNS complications. So this is what we know and what we see clinically. As we have been doing in all cases, basically we need to first really understand what the problem is. We have to zero in on the diagnosis, and then we can really talk about treatment. These are the few differentials that we see depending on whether the child is presenting in neonatal period or the child is presenting in a later age. What are the problems that we face as clinicians in a patient with OI? One is repeated fractures. Second is bone pain. Third is restricted mobility and reduced muscle strength because of excessive bed rest. This all leading to dependent living. There is add-on extraskeletal manifestations in the form of CNS, CVS, and hearing loss. And whatever management we do, whatever drug management we do, we have to also look at the short and long-term adverse effects of the medicines. Coming to management of OI, pharmacologically, the gold standard is bisphosphonates. They basically prevent bone resorption and increase the strength of the bone. We have been nowadays using injection zoledronic acid for these kids of OI. The dose is minimum once a year. We go up to 4 times a year depending on the number of fractures and disability of the patient. These injections are supposed to prevent refractures. They are also helpful in reducing the pain, and they are also an adjuvant to the orthopedic surgeries that we do for correcting the bone deformities. This is one child. If you see the clinical picture, his both femur are completely curved. A lateral profile, it should have been straight, but it is curved anteriorly. This is called as procurvatum deformity, and this is bilateral. So this is right side, which is probably in a V shape, and left side, which is more or less U shaped. So this is his right side X-ray, and this is his left side X-rays. With these deformities in place, these children are not able to walk, and if they try to walk, they end up with repeated fractures because the mechanical axis is not in line, and the stress that goes through the bone goes on one side of the bone, leading to repeated fractures. The gold line treatment for these fractures, as of now, is something called as telescopic nailing, wherein we have got, if you can see, a female rod and a male rod. on the X-ray, you can see this is the male rod which has been inserted into the metaphysis, and female rod which is inserted into the metaphysis of the proximal end. So as the child grows, these rods telescope out. So they move out of each other and they continue to give support to the bone with elongation of the bone. Prior to these nails, what we used to do was put a simple rod. But with growth, the rods used to get short, and the children used to get fracture at the junction of the rod and the bone. So with these telescopic rods in place, now the frequency of refractures after surgery have reduced, and the kids have been able to get ambulatory better in a better way. So this is one patient, a child of 5 to 6 years whom we have operated recently, a bilateral femur OI which we have operated. This is his elder sister. She's around 8 to 9 years old. So if you see, if an orthopedic surgeon sees the X-ray, he would see that this is not a very perfect X-ray. If you see the limb, yes, we agree this is not a very perfect limb, because we are dealing with a very imperfect bone. It's a very weak bone. It's a very soft bone. It's a very narrow bone. And fixing these bones, making them strong, and making these kids walk itself is a big challenge. This is one. This is his elder sister, wherein we operated both the femur and both the tibia. So prior to this surgery, she was completely in bed because all her 4 bones were bent. This we have done around 3 years back. Due to COVID lockdown, we had lost her to follow-up for last 1 year. She has come recently for follow-up, and we are planning for her bisphosphonate injection in near future. This is how she is walking. So again, she is not walking a very normal gait. She has got a lot of lurch. You can see she has got a wide-based gait. But the good thing is she is walking, she is independent, and she is ambulatory. So the mother has to take care of only one child. This child is now able to take care of her own. What is new in this in OI? These are few things that have come up on the horizon. We have started using teriparatide in near adult or adolescent OI patients. It is contraindicated in patients who have got open epiphysis, so we haven't yet tried it in children. Rest of therapies are yet in literature, and we haven't had an experience or a chance to use them. And what has been said in literature related to treatment of OI is that gene targeting approaches are going to be the game changer, and we are waiting for these things to happen so that a big chunk of patients are going to get properly rehabilitated. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Viranchi, for a wonderful presentation. To treat an OI child is really a challenging thing. We all know it's a multidisciplinary approach which is needed, and to make the child ambulatory is a big achievement for a doctor, for a parent, and for that child. So thanks for the case and presentation. So I think we will move ahead to the last case of today's session, which will be presented by Dr. Tushar Idhate. He's a first pediatric hemato-oncologist coming to Aurangabad, and he's practicing at MGM Medical College. I'll request Tushar to start his presentation.
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible, visible, and my
yes,
screen is...
Yes. Please make it full screen, I think, Tushar. Yeah. Yes, you can go ahead.
So, in the whole CME of rare diseases, so this is something which I wanted to highlight, which looks common, but maybe we are missing, as Madam were discussing, all of us we were discussing, maybe with the advances in the super specialty, somewhere we are lacking the general pediatrics. And this is one case where we all have to be careful that beyond tuberculosis also there are a few differentials which can, point out towards other diseases. So this is a case of bilateral pleural effusion, which we are going to discuss in short. So it was a 7-year-old girl who presented with fever since 10 days, cough since 5 to 6 days, and there was sudden onset breathlessness since 2 to 3 days. There was no any history of asthma or cough contact in the family. The child was anxious with dilated neck veins. There was tachypnea, there were chest retractions, and respiratory system examination revealed reduced entry on the both sides. She also had hepatosplenomegaly. Baseline investigations revealed normal hematological parameters with normal albumin and RFT also. So renal and hematological causes were apparently ruled out. Chest X-ray revealed there was bilateral pleural effusion, so ICD was inserted on both sides. This was the chest X-ray, which we can see bilateral ICDs are there. This is after ICD insertion. Montus test was done, it was negative, and pleural fluid examination was examined. Protein, sugar, ADA levels were normal. Cytology was also sent for malignant cells, it was normal. And to rule out connective tissue disorders, ANA was also done, and it was also negative. But surprisingly, the ICD train kept a daily output of more than 1 liters, and with strong suspicion of tuberculosis and clinical deterioration, child was started on AKT along with prednisolone. Gradually, respiratory distress reduced a little bit, but other parameters got deranged, such as BUN jumped to 104, creatinine went to 1.5, and this was the time when nephrology and hematology reference was given. And this is something which was surprising, which was the first X-ray which was done at a local town before the child was referred to Aurangabad, and we can very well notice there is a metasternal widening or metasternal mass before the or there are along with the effusion. So the points to note in this case from the beginning, if we see, which are not fitting into tuberculosis, where that there was a gross volume of ICD drain. More than 1 liter per day is not something very common in tuberculosis. X-ray and CT chest were showing metasternal mass, although it was not highlighted too much. The features of tumor lysis were seen after exposure of steroids. Along with the AKT, steroids were given. So tumor lysis features, increasing creatinine and increasing BUN, were seen. Unfortunately, in this case, treating pediatrician had thought about malignancy. He had sent pleural fluid cytology, but blast cells could not be picked on pleural fluid cytology. So all these points are actually suggestive of non-Hodgkin lymphoma of T type, T lymphoblastic lymphoma, with having bilateral pleural effusion, metasternal widening, and gross repeated effusion. So these are all pointers towards T lymphoblastic lymphoma. When we have metasternal mass, there are 3 headings. One is anterior metasternum, second is middle, and the posterior one. Most common in the anterior is thymoma, lymphoma, and teratoma and thyroidomasis. In the middle one, all related to the vascular and granulomatous diseases. And the posterior metasternum is known for neuroblastoma and other type of things. We also had a similar case of germ cell tumor recently, which was admitted in one of our pediatric hospitals. So metasternal mass or metasternal widening is something which we have to be aware, and we have to be cautious that most of these disorders are actually malignant. So whenever you get metasternal mass, or in this case there was metasternal widening and pleural effusion, you have to do certain diagnostic tests to rule out disorders. You have to be least invasive because these patients are on the verge of collapse of and having respiratory failure. So you have to avoid supine position and sedation, and do some baseline tests. CBC and peripheral smear to rule out any leukemia and malignant blast cells. AFP and beta HCG to look for any germ cell tumors. If possible, you should go for pleural tap and flow cytometry from the pleural fluid itself. You can do bone marrow examination if possible without sedation. Lymph node biopsy from peripheral lymph node. If you have peripheral lymph node, then you may not go for any invasive test, and you may just take out the peripheral lymph node. And the last, if you cannot arrive to any diagnosis along with this non-invasive test, last thing to do is metasternal mass biopsy. So in this patient, we had sent other tumor lysis parameters such as phosphorus was 14, uric acid was 12, creatinine was 1.5, potassium was 5.6, and CBC by this point after 6-7 days I had sort of showing neutropenia and thrombocytopenia as well. AFP and beta HCG were normal. The first thing for us, the emergency was to tackle with the tumor lysis, and the second was to arrive at some conclusive diagnosis. So IV fluid was changed to 120 ml per meter square of sodium normal saline without any potassium. Child was started on allopurinol to reduce uric acid. Tablet Sevelamer was started to take care of phosphorus. Option of dialysis and raspberry case were kept, but fortunately all tumor paralysis parameters showed improvement gradually. So diagnosis was done. The three tests we had done simultaneously because we did not have time. Child was already started on steroids. So we did bone marrow examination and pleural fluid flow cytometry both. And surprisingly, the blast cells were still present in both of the samples, and pleural fluid cytology flow cytometry itself confirmed to be a case of T lymphoblastic lymphoma. So in lymphoma, there is Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. In non-Hodgkin lymphoma, there is a large cell lymphoma, lymphoblastic lymphoma, and Burkitt lymphoma. In lymphoblastic lymphoma, the T lymphoblastic lymphoma is what our case is of. So with the advances in chemotherapy, more than 70% of these patients are treated and cured well. Cost of therapy has also reduced with the various government schemes and support of different NGOs. These are the chemotherapy protocols what we are using at our center. And coming to what is the role of pediatrician in these patients. So pediatrician is the first person to see this patient, to suspect their leukemia and lymphoma, stabilize the patient. He is the important link between patient and family on one end and pediatric oncologist on the other end. And there is a concept of shared care in this patient. So what are the do's and what are the don'ts to be done in these patients? Understand that it is a hematological emergency and it can be fatal within weeks, or in this case, it might be, even days if you don't start with chemotherapy. You have to start on IV fluids, preferably without potassium and dextrose. Normal saline is a good option. Antibiotics to be started if the child is febrile after sending CRP and blood culture whenever it is possible. Blood products as indicated. And so this has been said in many conferences that blood transfusion should not be given if you are suspecting leukemia. The take-home message is that the child should not be in failure. Then only you should avoid blood transfusion. But if somebody is referring patient from Latur or Bid and the hemoglobin is of 3, it will be definitely advisable to give 1 unit of transfusion before you ship the patient. Of course, you should not give any hydrocortisone or dexamethasone prior to this blood transfusion because steroid exposure is the one which we don't want. But transfusion, giving platelets, if the child is having active bleeding, you definitely can give 1 or 2 units of platelets also before the marrow is planned. You have to counsel the family about good prognosis and motivate them. What are the things we should not do? As we discussed in our case, whenever you have undiagnosed patient, please do not start on steroids because they cause tumor lysis risk. There is a diagnostic dilemma. In this case, fortunately, we could at least arrive to some diagnosis because the flow cytometry was sent on day 4, day 5. If it would have been 2 weeks, then maybe we would not have got the mass, we would not have got the fluid, and there would not have been any diagnosis in this patient. So it is very important to avoid steroid exposure in such patients. They also increase risk of infection and resistant disease. So childhood cancer is curable. Maybe we just have to be more vigilant, more careful when we see such patients, and timely diagnosis and timely referral to a specialist in these patients definitely can cure these patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Tushar. It was a nice case, and the important message from your talk is there should not be any empirical treatment. Previously, many physicians, pediatricians, we used to do anti-cox empirically, but now in the modern era, it is just obsolete to give any child empirical anti-cox treatment. So tissue diagnosis is very important. May it be pleural fluid, may it be ascitic fluid, may it be spine, brain, anything, but the tissue diagnosis is very important. There should not be any empirical treatment started. Thanks a lot for that case and a very important message given to us. So now we are at the end of our session and the forum is open to all the questions. So anybody wants to ask question, I will unmute everybody. And yes, you can unmute yourselves and we can take few questions, maybe 15-20 minutes, or we can have a half an hour chat also. There were all wonderful cases and lot to ask, lot to discuss. Okay, I will start myself. Dr. Pankaj, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Pankaj, I will ask you one question. Nephrocalcinosis. In your case, it was oxaluria, hyperoxaluria. So many a times we see the nephrocalcinosis cases, and it's actually a rare thing to use diuretics in a case of hypercalciuria, because the diuretics will increase the calciuria. So can you explain the mechanism how the diuretics are used and how they work in a case of calciuria? Can you throw some light on that?
Yes.
Mechanism of action of diuretics.
Diuretics, what we use is hydrochlorothiazide.
Yeah.
Hydrochlorothiazide actually prevents calcium excretion in the urine.
Yes.
Furosemide causes hypercalciuria.
Yes.
So furosemide should be avoided. What
Yes.
should be used? Hydrochlorothiazide. And most importantly, the underlying etiology, like suppose it is a RTA, the treatment
Yes.
is focused for correction of acidosis.
Yes.
Because with correction of acidosis and hypokalemia, calcium excretion decreases. But if it is very high calcium excretion, for temporary basis, we can add hydrochlorothiazide.
Yes. So the important thing is in diuretics, you have to specifically use hydrochlorothiazide when you want to avoid the hypercalciuria. Okay. And the second thing, how can we on USG picture, how can we differentiate, like it's a mild nephrocalcinosis, or how can we differentiate it? It's a nephrocalcinosis of other etiology and oxaluria.
No, it is difficult to differentiate, but the presentation at 5 to 6 months with such a florid white kidney and which is visible on X-ray, is the visibility of kidney on X-ray at this age. Probably there is no other differential only.
Yes.
It has to be oxalosis. And actually, this is not first case. Every year, 2 to 3 patients present like this.
Yes.
And X-ray becomes like a diagnostic tool for us, because most of our patient even doesn't afford for the genetic workup, which costs somewhere around 17K.
Yes, yes.
And even our mentality, like even for this child, we worked up aggressively, we forced aggressively because they were planning for next kid. If it would have been the last kid, then probably they would not have continued. Even they were not willing for biopsy.
Yes.
So everything has to be done from our side.
Yes.
There are a few practical problems also.
Yes, definitely.
I have a question for Suvarna. Hello.
Dr. Suvarna, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
What's the cause of black urine in that patient? Does it get excreted and turns black?
Actually, I tried a lot, and I even asked to one of the US authors for like SSADH natural history, but none of them have found out that there could be a black colored urine. So I am also right now clueless ki why she had black colored urine or what metabolite caused it or something like that. The child is 2.5 years currently, and she still has black colored urine malodorous intermittently. It's only during that phase she had a daily, at the age of 8 months, daily black colored urine. And so on the black colored urine only we did the pick up this SSADH deficiency. So even I have to find out from like if further research can be done on this, basically what is causing the black colored urine.
We need to know which chemical is causing black colored urine first.
And
I was thinking whether the two things are there in the same case.
Yeah, whether they are the two different
SSADH at one place, and there is the gene which is coding for alkaptonuria and
because alkapton, the urine color is classical of alkapton.
Yes, I was thinking on the same line.
Alkaptonuria, it is an adult
usually don't have
disease.
developmental,
It's not infancy.
delay.
It does not cause global developmental delay.
And
for alkaptonuria, there are nodules in the ear, or subcutaneous nodules is one of the common features. And urine is not black from starting. It is also from
usually understanding.
So this child had black colored from the onset of passage of urine.
And the second thing, I was a little surprised that yes, the child is having neurotransmitter disease and there are no movement disorders and CNS manifestation as such. The child had only hypotonia. That is rare thing. And did you do the CSF on this case?
I have not done CSF of this child. This basically SSADH deficiency, more than 50% can have seizure disorder.
Okay.
And it ends up with only intellectual disability. or autistic features or kind of
Yeah,
low
autistic feature is there with
expressivity
that.
from the child because of the inhibitory path, GABA being having in excess.
And did you do the amino acid and organic acid profile initially?
TMS and
TMS,
GCMS only
GCMS.
I
No,
did
not
twice.
TMS. I'm
Yeah.
talking about urine.
GCMS is about organic acid. So organic
Yes.
acids was done
And
twice.
plasma amino acids.
Plasma amino acids was not done.
Maybe that can give the clue, I think.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm
Should
not
go
sure
for
of
it.
amino acid levels or any derangement, particularly in this. It's mainly in gene
So we
reviews.
want to find out why the black color urine. Is it
Yeah, I
related
want to
some
find
amino
out,
acid
yes.
this
I
abnormality?
really want to share this case to senior medical geneticist, and if we can go ahead with some study abroad for this child, exactly what is the metabolite causing this change. So I'm also clueless for many things right now.
Okay.
I had a question for Viranchi sir. Viranchi sir is there?
Yes, I'm there.
Sir, like I also referred, or you referred 2-3 patients with osteogenesis imperfecta to me. How is the experience with zoledronic acid, error side effect profile, and reducing the number of fractures and quality of life? Like what's your experience?
We haven't really documented the data, but right now at Capon, we are giving that injection to around 15 kids. So nowadays we have something called as Party. So it's a Natzol Party. That's the brand that we use. Basically, it comes in a 100 ml vial. The dose comes in mls. So what we used to had to do was throw off the rest of the medicine. So nowadays we call 5, 6, 10 kids together. So there's single vial used for all of them. That saves the cost, and that also saves the medicine. It is not wasted. Frequency of fractures, yes, it has come down. Side effects, we haven't had a single case of fever or any irritability or any seizure disorder till now. There is one patient who is of type 5 OI, where she has excessive callus formation. With that callus formation has come down. I don't know whether it is related or not, but fracture frequency, yes, it has reduced, and it has basically helped us in mobilizing the patients. So once we operate them and we keep them on injection for at least once a year, they are better mobilized.
Viranchi, can I ask you one question? What is the difference between Pamidronate and Zolindronate? Means, what is the difference between the results?
Both are bisphosphonates.
Yes.
Primarily, I haven't had a chance to use Pamidronate because it is not available freely. Whatever literature is there, old literature is about Pamidronate.
Yes.
Since I started using bisphosphonates for kids of OI, I didn't get it. So we shifted to zoledronic acid. At that time, there was no literature. So we started very tentatively.
Okay.
But nowadays, in last 2-3 years, we have a lot of papers wherein everybody is using it. And probably the results are same because medicine comes from the same group.
Yes.
So action is more or less same.
Only thing, the frequency of injections you can reduce with Zolindronate. That is one advantage. Otherwise, I think Pamidronate is also available in the market. Yes, we give usually. Okay, any other question?
I have one question to all. How can a general pediatrician can know all these details?
Sir, all these details means...
Is it possible for general pediatrician to know all the details?
Very true, sir. I think being suspicious about some different findings, being curious about what every child is presenting, as it's a genetic diversity, it is just an open mind and vision, at least finding out is something different.
Yes. And I would suggest like Suvarna should develop one app for general pediatrician, Android app, where we can put the symptoms which are unusual and you get differentials. So it is your new job to.
Yeah, ma'am, we all can do it together.
Sir, I think that's why we should arrange such frequent meets on our platform. Yes. May it be online, offline, but because there are so many interesting cases where not only one system is involved, there are multiple systems involved, 2 or 3 systems. And we also usually require everybody's opinion, and general pediatrics can give us very good, means I'm always happy when I get very good cases from senior pediatricians. They are half diagnosed or nearly diagnosed. The only thing why they refer to us that we are used to see these cases. We are used to do a workup and further treatment. So basic pediatric, again, I have to emphasize here that it is very important, and we should organize frequent such meets. Maybe the cases can be taken from general pediatrics. Maybe they can be in some puzzle form. So and so case is presented, these are the symptoms, how to go ahead, and this can be surprise cases, and we should have a means free discussion. It will enrich ourselves also. And what you said, sir, that how can general pediatrics can know our students, our pediatricians also can get benefited, means
So maybe Sandhya, next you can arrange for office practice.
Yes,
Basically, we need to know when to refer the child to the specialist.
Yes,
That is the point. Second thing, we can also have some cases when which can be presented by a general pediatrician, which have a diagnostic problem, and they have referred to the specialist, and the diagnosis was done. That can be one of the scenario or some points to be taken, so that we can arrange a webinar according to that.
Yes.
Problems faced by general pediatrician and solved by the super specialist, like that.
Yes. So questions will be from their side and answers will be from the subspecialty group. It's a wonderful idea. Sir, next month only we will have a webinar of this thing, academic clinic, first academic clinic. There we can try this idea, at least 1 or 2 cases only, and broad discussion on that. We can have that. Anybody else? Any question?
I mean, फक्त Sunday morning ठेवला गेला इस time.
काय म्हणाला तुषार? मी ऐकलं नाही.
Sunday morning ठेवला का next time?
बर बाबा, रात्री घेऊ, काही प्रॉब्लेम नाही. In the night we can.
Apart from the participants, maybe other people find it very convenient.
Yes.
Today was definitely the occasion, so we did not want to miss that.
Yes.
Routine, it will be like a humble suggestion from my side that if it is, in the maybe 9 o'clock slot is one slot.
Or 4 to 6.
4 to 6. But whatever I have seen, 9 onwards is a better present means, because everybody finishes his work, and 9:30. Surely we will.
So that more and more people will, sort of, if it is general case, definitely they will like to join. The only thing is that it will be convenient for them to join.
Yes.
I have one question to Madhvi.
Yeah.
Madhvi, your case was neuropathy, but then there was no ulcer and they present with non-healing ulcers and they are referred to surgeons. And how do we, your case was only having some bites and all. And the child did not
she had non-healing oral ulcers.
Okay,
she had non-healing oral ulcers. But, and the thing is that the parents, though not much educated, were very intelligent. Mother could say that even the previous child was almost similar with the skin. At the age of 9 months only, she had noticed that. So they were under close monitoring though at their home. So first she presented with oral ulcers, and then she had those self-mutilating behavior and the gangrene.
Because whatever cases of neuropathy we have seen, they were referred to Dr. Viranchi for ulcers, non-healing ulcers. Then we could retrospectively diagnose them as neuropathy, and then we did that.
This girl didn't have any feature on the NCV study. The sensory studies were also
that is really surprising. Again, did you try to do it again to prove that it was HSA?
It was not repeated again, because once the genetic diagnosis was confirmed and she was fitting into that, so it was not repeated later on. Though we could clinically came to the similar differential diagnosis like Lede HSN or Leishnian. Sometimes Leishnian, they do have milder variants, can have the similar manifestation, with few ulcers and some global delay. But at the end, Leishnian will deteriorate significantly.
Okay, yes.
Anybody else?
So should we wrap up?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think questions are over now.
Thank you all.
Nice to
Yes.
see you all.
Thank you so much.
It was really a good
Thank you, Sandhya
presentation.
ma'am and Khandelwal sir.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all of you also for discussing such a nice cases. And it's a start, I think. We will just continue this academic platform. Okay.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, sir.
Thank
and
you.
madam.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Enjoy your Sunday, everybody. On 4th of March, we are coming with a World Obesity Day celebration. And at around 7:30 p.m. on 4th March, we are having an open webinar for all children, teachers, parents, and all doctors. So please do attend and do share the flyers. We are now going to continually share for 2-3 days. It's an important rising issue in lockdown. So please share it to all the patients, all the groups. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.